As we know, the obvious of Athanasius at Antioch became the obvious of much of Egypt and eventually of much of the Christian world, both in Byzantium and in the Latin West. Athanasius's distinctive view of Antony and his distinctive monastic lifestyle, which included manual labor, determined the image of Egyptian monasticism, which visitors from foreign lands took back with them to their home countries throughout the 4th century, back to Gaul, back to Italy, back to Constantinople, back to Anatolia. Nothing shows this more clearly than does a phrase that exists only in the Coptic version of the famous Lausiac history of Palladius. Though Palladius's Lausiac history was finally presented to Lausus, an influential eunuch at the court of Constantinople in 420, Palladius's classic account of the monks of Egypt and elsewhere had already been drafted by him in many versions. Some of these drafts are preserved in Coptic and Syriac translations. Because of this, we can catch a very precious echo in these first drafts of the first impressions of a foreign visitor to Egypt in the late 4th century, in the late 380s, no more than a generation after Athanasius's life of Antony. The message that Palladius picked up was a statement of the essence of Egyptian monasticism. Egyptians, he said, were men of the desert. For that indeed, he writes, is their great glory, as is also, Palladius was careful to add, as is also the work of the hand, pichob pijij, which is an ornament, a pride to the men of Egypt. Now, it takes a considerable effort of the scholarly imagination to realize that at the time when Athanasius wrote, and when a generation or two later, foreign visitors came in increasing numbers to report on the monks of Egypt, this view of Egyptian monasticism was in fact very far from being secure and unchallenged. This is because, for most of us, Mani, the Mesopotamian prophet, the holy warriors of Syria, and Antony of Egypt appear to belong, each of them, to a very different world. But this, of course, was not so. They each shared, if each in a different way, in widely diverse currents of ascetic experimentation which flowed unhindered across the Fertile Crescent deep into Egypt. They seem very different to us because I think we tend to separate each group from the other according to theological principles. We deem the Manichaeans to be total outsiders to normal Christianity, and we also tend to regard the monasticism of Egypt as somehow more normal than the wild and woolly monks of Syria. Now, the time has come, therefore, I think, to pay more attention to the issues which these seemingly disparate groups had in common. As we've seen, they were truly basic image. They brought to the surface, in Christian form, millennial arguments on the nature of man and society. These arguments presented work as the curse of humankind, freedom from work as the sine qua non of entry into an angelic lifestyle. By contrast, the monks of Egypt raised work itself to the status of a privileged denotator of the monk and by implication of the human condition as a whole. So let me spend this lecture trying to point out why this might be so and what were the wider implications for views of human nature and of human society of this distinctive Egyptian stance to the facts of labor. First, let's look at it in terms of the ancient Christian and Jewish preoccupation with the avoidance of dependence creating gifts. How could a monk receive gifts without somehow being tarnished by the suspicion that he had succumbed to the love of money? How could he make plain that he had not fallen under an obligation to the giver, as would be normal in a society ruled by rigid laws of reciprocity and dominated in normal life by powerful patrons? We must remember that the monks of Egypt were surrounded by any number of potential givers and patrons. It's important to really stress this fact. So much recent scholarship on Egyptian monasticism has been inward-looking. It's been devoted to the relations between monks, bishops, and clergy, so much so that we tend to forget that in many ways it was the laity who did most to determine the manner in which the monks presented themselves to society at large. For one gifted clerical author, such as Athanasius or Palladius, there were hundreds of laymen and women whose daily expectations silently moulded the image of the monks and the nuns of Egypt. Altogether, in studying monasticism in Egypt and elsewhere, we should always look out for the discreet presence of the laity. Like an X-ray which shows bones clearly, while the cartilage in which they are enveloped is barely visible, so the laity do not make as vivid an appearance in modern accounts of Egyptian monasticism as do the clergy. But they were there. Indeed, as the recent work, for instance, of Maria Chiara Giorda, especially in her recent book, Il Regno di Dio in Terra, makes plain, monasticism was an overwhelmingly lay movement. It recruited most of its adherents from the laity, and often in middle age, after they had lived a lifetime of lay piety. Its successors were watched with intent eyes by the laity. For the vivid lives of the monks and nuns brought to Egypt what lay Christians, and indeed what most religious persons in late antiquity had always wanted: access to the holy, in this case through persons touched by the hand of God. One of the very first mentions of a monk comes from a papyrus of around 340, a decade before Athanasius' Life of Antony. In it, the lady wrote to an otherwise totally unknown ascetic, Paphnutius. I believe she wrote that I receive healing because of your prayers, for the revelations of ascetics concerning the future are always clear. Now, the Lady Valeria was an exact contemporary of the Lady Irene, who had been praised by the Manichaean elect of Cales. Both inhabited a religious landscape where individual holy persons were believed to be able to open the door to the other world. But each group handled in a very different manner the issue of the bond established between holy persons or group of persons and those who turned to them. The Manichaean elect accepted gifts of food and shelter from their laity in a splendidly de haute en bas manner. They were convinced that their mighty prayers alone were more than enough return to the Lady Irene for her great jars of oil. Now, we don't know about the role played by gifts in the actual relationship between the monk Paphnutius and the Lady Valeria. But certainly in the monastic circles encouraged by Athanasius and reported upon by Palladius and others, the work of the hand, Pachomius, came to bear a quite unusual weight of meaning because it defined the nature of the exchange of gifts between monks and lay persons. The dogged display of self-sufficiency gained through the work of the hands on the part of the monks altered the way in which gifts to monks were perceived. Monks presented themselves as constant workers, as untouched by idleness. This meant that they felt free to accept the financial support which was pressed upon them by their many lay clients because it was thought they were sufficiently self-sufficient to be above asking for this support. Their handiwork showed that they were not beggars, still less would they be spongers. The little piles of basket work that lay at the back of every cell, the plaited palm fronds soaking in water at the door, the loaves of bread kept back for passing strangers, the little vegetable gardens carefully tended so as to feed others, none of these were formula for complete economic autarky. Rather, they gave a slightly different message. They were clear social signals. They were designed to ward off the suspicions that had piled up over the centuries through hostile observation of religious freeloaders and of charismatic panhandlers.